My name is Michael Haag. I am a senior threat researcher here at Splunk, and this is my talk on hunting Windows U-boats with cyber depth charges. Who am I? I'm M Haggis on Twitter. Get M Haggis. Probably not best to Google Haggis right now. But yeah, I currently have been at Splunk for about a year and a half on the threat research team. This is where we simulate or emulate threat actors. We research new techniques, generate content, and we publish all this out into Splunk Enterprise Security, and we have an app, Enterprise Security Content Update. And prior to Splunk, I was at Red Canary for 4 years, and you may know me from Atomic Red Team and other parts of threat research that we had done there. So yeah, let's hop in. I'm very excited to share this with everybody. All right, so back in 2018, I was digging through a carbon black response binary store, and it was just kind of like looking for interesting binaries that were, being collected by carbon black response, and ended up coming across a very interesting, suspicious system .sys file. Ended up being a driver. It was named like a dump file and whatnot, and it took us a while to get this blog out at Red Canary because we didn't really know how to shape it, because we didn't know how it got to this environment or got to this particular endpoint. We had shipped the detection, but we didn't have all the artifacts there. And so Casey and I, we had dug into this. We identified it was definitely some type of a rootkit loading up into this endpoint. We didn't know what or why. And then later we shipped another detection or a blog related to some of the behaviors related to it. It ended up being a report pushed out by NS Focus Global called Nugget Phantom. And they had a kind of like this little graph here showing how this got onto an endpoint, and we had all the same similar artifacts. And you can see it kind of popped in through Eternal Blue. They had renamed JPEG files, different things leading up to, and then the piece that we caught was this dump underscore x64.sys file. It was signed, and it had an expired certificate. But with Windows, a lot of things can still be loaded, and that's where a lot of this talk comes from. And so all these behaviors are very interesting, and it took us a long time to truly see what this is coming from and why it was here. And this was one of the first true driver-based rootkits that I had found, and it was just so strange. And getting there took a lot of work. And so the problem and why I'm here talking about it is hunting drivers as Windows rootkits is very hard. The volume of data coming out of Windows is very high for module loads, DLLs, sys files. There's talking about from a threat hunting perspective, the reward is kind of low. You can't just say go find rootkits, because you won't find a rootkit out of a 50,000 endpoint environment. And if there is one, it's going to be very hard to identify it, without taking apart every single one of them or trying to identify what each driver is doing. It could take years, and it's just a very slow process. And call it a special level of threat hunting. It's just a different place to be, and the challenge is very hard. So that's why I think this is a very interesting talk, and try to get people to think about drivers a little bit differently, because they are actively being used. They have actively always been used in the past by, what you want to call it, nation state threat actors. They use these things to persist in a very long-term, long-form way. So our agenda is, what do drivers buy an adversary? Why would an adversary use a driver? We're going to talk about driver signing, because signing goes pretty hand in hand with how Windows, Microsoft, and a driver can be loaded into the operating system. We'll dig into hunting for them. We'll look at living off the land drivers, or BYOVD, bring your own vulnerable driver. And then hopefully give some tips on how to prevent this, what's native to Windows, and dig into all of that fun stuff. All right, so jumping in, my favorite little cat thumbs up. What do drivers buy an adversary? The tricky thing with Windows is we are dealing with an operating system that's been around for a long time. So we were looking at a lot of backwards compatibility here. Microsoft Windows will load signed, unsigned drivers, old and new. There are pieces in there today that will help us natively prevent these things. But typically, if it's been there for a long time, a driver that's malicious or vulnerable, it's probably still there today, and it's still being loaded up. And that's what makes these really hard. It does provide that kernel level persistence, whether it's something that's being exploited as a vulnerable driver, or it was actually a malicious driver that was placed there, being loaded and executed that way. This is extremely hard for antivirus products to prevent. And thankfully, Microsoft is taking a stronger approach with how they allow drivers to be signed and vetted and placed into the operating system. But AV products today, they don't really see vulnerable drivers as malicious, because if you start preventing legitimate drivers, then you start preventing things from working on the operating system. And they're hard to detect. They're not named evilDriver.sys. They could be anything like what we saw with the Nugget Phantom tool. It was just dump underscore some numbers.sys. And you can't just look at it and say that that's bad based on the name. So it can get really tricky when you're diving into these things and trying to identify what is truly malicious. And like I mentioned, drivers and signing go very hand in hand. Back in the day, 32-bit drivers were always unsigned, and you will probably see some of these in your environment still. Windows Vista and up, we started seeing new enforcement. Again, it did require that backwards compatibility. Backwards compatibility introduced living off the land drivers, or rephrased by Clipsium as screwed drivers. Or we see in MITRE, I got the T number, it's T1068, where they reference BYOVD, bring your own vulnerable driver. Now, when we're talking about vulnerable drivers, these are drivers that are signed, they're legitimate. Maybe they're expired or distrusted today, but you can still bring them into the operating system and load them to do whatever you need to do. And then it also led to certificate theft. Probably the most recent one we know for cert theft was related to the Lapsus group, where they had infiltrated NVIDIA, stole their certificate, and then all of a sudden we started seeing like signed malware. So all of this kind of combined is how like drivers and signatures truly go hand in hand. And there's a lot more here, but there's only so much we can dive into just related to the signing and how these things kind of go down. But that's the gist. So what to hunt, where to hunt, and how are we going to hunt for these things? Let's dive in. Another quick thing dropped earlier this year, which so many things have dropped this year. But this one stood out to me, and this one I thought was really cool because this group, this Chinese linked actors, Symantec says it's one of the most advanced pieces of malware they saw. It's a Daxon stealthy backdoor, and most all of this was malicious drivers that they had signed. And so when I saw that, this is the first thing I thought was, let's go and dump this and see what's actually in these files, because I want to understand how it's like who the publisher was, what they're saying their company is, and if it's truly signed. So I used a tool called SIG-check from sysinternals, and so this screenshot here, we'll see on the left whether it's verified, and you can see most of them are signed. Some were explicitly revoked, which is good or bad, I don't know, but it'll still be loaded. And then the 32-bit ones are going to be mostly your unsigned ones here. And then when you're looking at these, the date's always of interest. A lot of this can be spoofed and changed however you want. Publisher and company are interesting. This is one of the first things that stood out to me was they're saying Microsoft Corporation, but the DIGSIG publisher is something else entirely, which it would be Microsoft if it was publisher. So those are really off for me. Some of them have descriptions, which is great, but sometimes the description, doesn't really mean anything, which Microsoft would never ship. I would assume Microsoft would never ship a WAN transport driver or MS LAN driver, things like that. And then under the product, one I'll call out is right here, why I highlight it. Thing that stood out to me real quick was the way Microsoft signs these and the way the product is, this one in particular has a couple spaces in front of its name. And so to confirm that, what I ended up doing was I used PowerShell to just dump a bunch of version info for these. And I call it out right here. You can see this one has spaces in front of it. And so they kind of look legitimate, being Microsoft Windows OS for the product. You know, they got the names kind of right. Some of them are signed. This is why it's so important to understand what's running in your environment, and goes right back to with Nugget Phantom, you know, what's out there, you know, what's running as signed or distrusted and things like that. That's why the signing stuff is so important for rootkits, because again, it just makes them look far more legitimate than they really are. And that just here at the bottom leads to just the whole code dump of all of these drivers, the spreadsheet and the PowerShell output here. So I kind of look at the signature, the certificate data, kind of the same way Carbon Black Response shows it in the product. I just kind of wanted to break this down so everybody kind of sees what these look like. So DIGSIG result is like whether it's signed or unsigned, or in this case, it's showing up as signed with SIG check. You got your publisher, which is like this Beijing type corp, company name, Microsoft, and transport driver and the product, things like that. So you can kind of see where these align with Carbon Black Response. And so you can see if you were hunting for these types of things in any product, or manually sifting through an endpoint, this data is very important, and it can tell you puzzles gives you pieces to the puzzle, and you have to kind of combine these things and understand what's legitimate or not. A really interesting hunt is going back to that timepiece here and saying, what's running into my environment from 2015 and before? And you might find some really old software that had installed a driver years ago, or you might find it today. Somebody's trying to install a piece of software that has a driver required on there that's a really old signed driver. It's a really sketchy world, digging into drivers and the signatures and all that. So it's kind of like almost like two talks in one. You're like, hey, I'm going for rootkits, but at the same time, I have to know and understand a little bit about how signing works with this. So drivers, they can be loaded kind of from pretty much anywhere. Typically, they will always legitimately come out of a driver's path in System32 drivers, or you'll see like sometimes adversary will drop it under spool drivers, or they'll put it into program data or Windows temp, things like that. Those are really good hunts. They're very simple to go after. If you want to find sys files, .sys files running from non-standard paths, you can say not in these couple paths that for your environment, and then start to kind of drill down from there. For like Nugget Phantom or Daxon, those types of things, this little Carbon Black query here at the bottom says, looking for drivers that are explicitly distrusted. Well, you can say not in this path, but I want to find explicitly distrusted binaries or sys files in my environment. That'd be one way to go after it. DIGSIG result really helps to narrow down the amount of data you have to look at. There will be false positives. And if you just remove the DIGSIG result, you'll just get every system file running in your environment. So you have to play with the data, balance the amount of volume of the information you want to have to dig through. And it gets just voluminous because now you're just looking at everything. But like we saw with Daxon, you'll find stuff with Microsoft tied to it with a different publisher, and then those will start to stand out. You might find, adware and random things like that popping. And yeah, I make the name because malicious drivers are never just evil driver.sys. They can be anything, right? And there's all kinds of names that you'll find out there. And you saw Daxon use pretty commonly things to blend in. They want to persist, right? And that's the whole point of using a rootkit as a driver. You want to persist on this endpoint for an extremely long period of time without being detected. And so what's another place we can look at? So with Daxon or with any driver in your environment, you can go and look for new services being registered or drivers being registered. And so Under current control set services, you can find new and all drivers being registered. And so this is a really good example to like say like an adversary gets on the box or using Cobalt Strike or something, and they register a new driver. And this would be a cool place where you would see the registration happening, someone writing to services, register 32 hitting it, like why, what's so, monitoring it. It might be an avenue, but it's not going to be the most perfect avenue because you'll end up finding that there's always something going on with drivers being registered or new services being registered here. They can be a little voluminous. The two registry keys here at the bottom, this is the safe boot, safe mode, persistent. So an adversary may hit these to keep their driver loading up into safe mode. So if you were attempting to, maybe something suspicious happened on this box and while they registered it into safe mode, you're in safe mode, it's still going to load up and call out. Back to Nugget Phantom, it most likely was just mining for Bitcoins, but they also wanted to do it in safe mode. So no matter what, they persisted for a very long period of time so that they could just get Bitcoin, right? So there's a lot of persistence here, and registry is a great place to go and monitor. These two particular keys, I added an atomic test for it. You can find this in Atomic Red Team, where you can just simulate that behavior to go and try to identify any kind of writes to the safe boot key there, that whole path. Another one that's really cool with Windows, thankfully, we have an EventCode 7045. And if you want to just look at all 7045s in your environment, remove the service type here, and it will show you everything being registered. And it's not just kernel mode drivers. You'll see all kinds of data popping. But thankfully, we can set this to just looking at kernel mode drivers being added and registered to your environment. It may be luminous. You might find a lot of things happening all the time. But once you start to narrow it down and get like a decent baseline of what's new or what's kind of normal and happening, you can start to see those patterns pop up, and you get a really good idea of what's known good and known bad for your environment. And a lot of drivering and whatnot is based on just, unfortunately, a baseline of what's happening in your environment. There's no perfect answer for going after these things, unfortunately. So yeah, we talked briefly about little drivers, screwdrivers back on the signing side of things. There's been some pretty solid research out there about vulnerable drivers. Capcom driver has been around a very long time. There's some Dell drivers out there most recently, which was blogged by Rapid7 on the second link, which back in 2021, just last December, I think there's 3 Dell drivers that can still be abused today. And Rapid7 walks through how to abuse those, which is incredible, really cool stuff. There's some ASRock drivers. So we're talking not just, random drivers out there, but these are, Dell drivers. This is like hardware-based type drivers that are just vulnerable and can still be abused. Microsoft has a really solid block list, and this should be enabled by default today in Windows 10, 11. So if you were to attempt to load up the Capcom driver, it should be blocked. If it's not, then you probably need to go and start revisiting these rules and start blocking these. Now, the Dell drivers are not on the Microsoft block list. There's 3 of them, and they're not too old, but they're interesting, and they should be tracked in a certain way, because obviously many large organizations use Dell hardware, and these drivers are most likely there. If you've had these, if you had this type of hardware for a couple of years now, you'll have these Dell drivers most likely. And whether they're vulnerable or not, this is where you have to go in and dig, look at that version of the driver, determine if you can update it to the latest without breaking things, and then go from there, right? So yeah, Eclipsium did their research a couple of years ago. I don't think they've had an update in a year or two, but they have a long list of drivers that may be abused. And then Attacker KB has a CVE for one of them here as well. So yeah, hopefully this helps you get a good idea and go and chase these. I've tried to create a spreadsheet of these once or twice before, but I feel like there's just so much variance and so much data to share on this that there's not just like a good place to just dump it. But hopefully I'll get this done soon, and I got to get it out there. I think it's worthwhile that at least folks can see it all in one place. Oh, so this is the problem, right? Is Windows will load them all. I worked for a large corporation prior to Red Canary. We had 50,000 endpoints all around the globe. I wish we could just say, Microsoft, enable your prevention and block all these things, or why is my AV not preventing these things, or at least like telling me about them. We had old software going back to like XP and everything like that. Like it's just old stuff and it will just load it. 36-bit unsigned drivers. How do you know they're bad or good? Like there's just so much. And then upgrading these systems to today, having to use this old piece of software, old hardware that requires a driver. You can't just turn these things off, right? Like you got a business to run. And that's the hard part, is Windows will just go ahead and load every single one of them, which stinks. So let's stack and rank all of these, right? So how do we kind of dig into our hunting, dig into, trying to identify these, using, whatever data sources we have. And so in this particular case, I'm just using Splunk, I'm using Sysmon. I have a config that I share called Hunting Naked. There's other configs that you can use with Sysmon where you can just, say, show me everything for EventCode 6. 6 is driver loading. And so here, I'm just saying, show me sys files, all EventCode 6 here, whether they're signed, who signed it, that's our signature piece, and whether it's still signed. And in this case, you can see I was playing with some of the Dell drivers, Capcom drivers are in here. And this is running on what we have at Splunk is called the Splunk attack range. And so I'm just loading this up into a server 2016 machine and was just playing with them. Pretty simple to do. And I'll share all of this on my repo. I'll give that link out here in a minute. But yeah, you can see different paths, all that kind of stuff, and just playing and loading, and it all works just fine. I did not exploit these, but the fact that these are running in an environment from non-standard paths is kind of like one of those pieces where you want to go and inventory and understand in your environment, what's happening out there, where are sys files loading. So if you do have an EDR or a place where this type of data is like central, you can dig through sys files and understand why are they running from non-standard paths. Is it a particular software that requires it to be in this random place? Or can it be updated or removed so that you don't have to deal with it? And then I also created a very basic dashboard in Splunk, which again will be on my repo. And I'm just looking for like new sys files coming in my environment. And at the time, I was playing with Capcom and whatnot, so you can see those. And then creating a new or adding a new kernel driver. So this is the 7045 and sc.exe, saying create this new, driver, type is kernel, start it, and ship it that way. So there are ways we can go and look for these things. They may not all be the same. Adversaries may not do this every single time by registering it or, whatnot, but it's hopefully with 7045 and registry, looking for new system files on disk, things like that, all kind of help and give us some better visibility into what's happening out there. And then like kind of on the EDR side, where do sys files load? You'll find all of your drivers loading into NTOS kernel. And if you ever looked at NTOS kernel, it is it's a barn burner. There's just tons of things going all the time. And so I would look at this with Carbon Black Response, and it's everything. So I always try to limit the what I want to look at based on the digital signature results. So that signing data, is it distrusted or is it unsigned? Yeah, you're going to miss things. You're going to miss whether, a signed malicious driver or vulnerable drivers loading, things like that. But maybe we can find some distrusted ones, which we did see with Daxon. Some were explicitly distrusted. And with Nugget Phantom, it was distrusted as well. So we can go and look for these things into NTOS kernel. And the way CB response works at the time was you could say the digital signature result of the module load is unsigned or distrusted into NTOS kernel. Again, it's voluminous. There's going to be so many things going on in most organizations. You can also perform this same type of pattern looking for the results, loading into like LSAS. LSAS is another one that will just kind of load a lot of things, and it's a lot of just volume and data. And you're like, why is a unsigned DLL loading into LSAS? It makes no sense. But if you're working on Windows long enough, it all makes sense. So I don't know if it's a sinking ship, but it's a ship, right? And so we keep digging and going deeper into these things. You know, digging into signing, digging into drivers, trying to understand these patterns, and, you know, depending on how large your organization is, what's the best way for you to go and pull this data back? Is it one by one? Do you have an EDR? Is this data somehow central? To identify these things and to do better at it. I call these PenTestReportTips. On Twitter, I call it red team tips, because I always feel like whenever we get a report from a pen test or a red team, is very just like inventory drivers, enable Windows attack surface reduction rules, very high level. Maybe, you know, you can't do it in your org. I could never do it in my org. It's always these hard things like, yeah, sure, you know. But I think it's important to know that there are things that we can do. We can inventory drivers. That's not too crazy hard, but it's hard. Attack surface reduction rules. You can enable these through PowerShell. And I always say that if you can't enable them to prevention, at least put it in audit and get that data somewhere. So then you can at least see maybe a Capcom driver is out there and it's either legit or not being used. At least you know it's there, and ASR could prevent that for you. Or say like those ASRock drivers or something like that. Anything on the Microsoft block list is here. ASR will help you prevent these things pretty much almost out of the box, and you're ready to go. If you can't enforce or prevent, go for audit. Use secure boot, very simple, right? Hopefully a lot of these things are enabled today. There is a new thing with Windows. Last couple of years, driver signing enforcement. Microsoft has really taken steps to prevent just anything from loading that's signed, but there's still ways around it, as we've kind of seen with vulnerable drivers that are signed. Implement a type of application control. Back then, you know, it was Bit9. It's like enterprise prevent or something today. There's other ones out there. There's a lot of app control tools, even Defender application control, or a tool like App Locker. You can prevent sys files from loading out of non-standard paths. Once you have your inventory, you can ship an App Locker policy that says, do not load sys files from program data. And from then on, hopefully, you know, you never have to deal with it, but something bad will never run out of those certain paths. So yeah, and it's sort of a summary of all of this, right? The conclusion is very much, this is hard. There's a ton of data out there to be dug through and to be had. However, getting to a place of knowing what's there, like an enlightenment type place, knowing what's there, all of this is obtainable. If you can't prevent it, at least we can go and dig and hunt for these things and identify them. Definitely look into preventative measures. If you haven't seen how App Locker works or ASR rules and how they can be enabled and prevented, I'll share my link to my repo where I have a lot of like just the simple basic stuff to kind of run with. Check for prevalence, look for drivers out there, what's out there. And we have a list based on Eclipsium, Microsoft, Rapid7. They have all dumped a list of vulnerable drivers. At least we can go and understand, all right, you know, we run Dell, we have a lot of Dell drivers. Okay, like we should probably look at versions and make sure they've been updated in the last couple of years, things like that. It's mostly just keeping an eye on these things, right? So what's new? What's been recently registered as a kernel mode driver in my environment? And if you haven't, check out Atomic Red Team. There's a lot of good data in there, and my repo will have a simple little atomic test that will help you to register a driver, and then you can go and, you know, hunt for it and check it out, whether it's your EDR or in, you know, Splunk, or if you're trying to do something more manual, you could do it all these different ways. So yeah, thank you for listening. I don't know if I went fast or slow, I don't know, but my repo's here, GitHub mhaggis/notes. I have a drivers path in there, and inside I have my slide, I have notes. I also have a vulnerable driver to play with. things like that. Yeah, thank you all for listening. Thank you, Sans, for having me. I really appreciate it.